global public debt is at record levels. It's comparable only to World War II. So not only public debt, but also private debt is at very high levels. And it is a contingent liability. We've all seen private debt end up being on the public balance sheet. I know my own country in Turkey. I worked there during the crisis years after 2001. We had debt to GDP 30%. Almost overnight, it jumped to 90%. Of course, it has links to the needed devaluation and the adjustment and so on. But it was also a lot of debt that was hidden and was actually made transparent with the reform. So there are contingent liabilities, there are concerns about that transparency, and with different actors, different private sector, public sector actors. So that's a second point, that we have not only very high public sector debt, but also very high private sector debt. And then third point is what you also talked about. We have seen central banks being key drivers of the secular decline in interest rates, along with, of course, low productivity and low growth rates. But that's changing. How permanent this will be, how persistent this will be, remains to be seen. But I think we could say that the outlook is now for relatively higher and more volatile interest rates going forward, precisely because of all the issues that you mentioned. So that's a key concern for us, that servicing costs, and that has implications to the extent that you have the real interest rate and real growth differential not conducive to debt reduction for some countries. That, of course, worries us. For emerging market countries, the median external debt service is now almost 50% higher at 11% of revenues compared to 8% in about 10 years ago. For low-income countries, it's actually much higher. It's about 2.5 times higher than just a decade ago. 14% of revenues, excluding grants, go to financing debt service. That's compared to 6% in 2013. So we have seen a sharp increase in debt servicing costs, both for emerging markets and low-income countries. Of course, there are differences across countries. I'm just talking about the median. Now, we actually just published some research, a blog today, which looks at the median, the differences across countries, and we do a lot of work in trying to understand country by country the developments and how we can best support them. Fourthly, we see a big change in terms of the creditor landscape. We used to have, for a lot of the emerging markets and low-income countries, it used to be what we call the Paris Club, the official creditors, as well as some of the advanced economies, as well as multilateral debt. Now you see much higher share of private sector debt, private creditors that are holding external debt of course, emerging market countries, but also low-income countries. You see in 10 years, for low-income countries, private credit debt private creditors' position jumped from 11 to 28% of total debt. So you do see major changes in terms of the creditor landscape. So what does that mean? That has implications, of course, as to how countries can use their revenues, fiscal revenues, what expenditures they can take on in terms of anything from capital investment to health, education, development needs, as well as other needs compared to servicing debt. So I think that's a key concern that we have now, which is more so than solvency. We haven't seen any, and knock on wood, we had last one that asked for debt restructuring was Ghana about a year ago. I think it's good that we have made some progress. We'll come to this as we discuss policies and approaches that we are taking as the global community in terms of resolving debt issues. But the point is, we haven't seen major solvency problems, neither in most of the emerging market countries, and also in major low-income countries. That said, the key concern is the liquidity issues. How there are major financing needs that these countries face. You know, we talked about health, health, education, and so on, let alone climate finance, the climate transition, and they have limited fiscal space, and that fiscal space has been declining due to high debt servicing costs. So that's the key issue ahead of us. It doesn't affect all countries across the board, of course. We have to be careful. It's more of a problem in some of the countries, but I wanted to ask you your views on this issue of debt and increasing debt servicing burdens.
Well, these are fascinating and important questions. So let's just start with the nature of the debt positions and how they should be measured. You talked about public and private, rightly. I think it is important to remember, because it bears essentially on fiscal flexibility or fiscal space everywhere, but certainly in high-income countries, that they have what I think of as implicit debt, which are commitments we don't normally include in public debt, namely commitments to pay pensions, pensions of their own employees, pensions, national pensions more generally, and in practice, the commitments to pay a whole slew of welfare payments, health, education, family support, and so forth. And this isn't, of course, now just in high-income countries. Some form of welfare state has been put in place in many other countries, rightly by and large, and cutting those expenditures is immensely costly, not just politically, which is obvious, but also in terms of the impact on the functioning of society, on the human capital, the whole basis on which countries can grow. And this is related to my reaction to this question of insolvency versus illiquidity. So in other words, when is debt a problem, and how is it a problem? I tend to feel that when we're talking about private corporations, or even perhaps private individuals, we can make this distinction with some clarity. But when we're talking about states, the distinction between insolvency and illiquidity is essentially a political one, not an economic one, in the sense that, in some sense, it is usually, almost always possible, in some theoretical sense, for a country to continue to serve its debt if it sacrifices enough else. I mean, it is possible for a country, if it's run sufficiently ruthlessly, and they have frequently been in the past, by their own governments or occupying powers, God forbid, to extract the resources needed to make their debt whole. But if the price of doing so you could say this country looks solvent, it can service its debts. But if the price of doing so is to put a merciless squeeze on the welfare of the public, of the growth potential of the country, on the services on which people rightly depend, and in poor countries that's at a very low level, then the consequences will show not in default, but in miserable economic performance and worse, terrible suffering, human suffering. And I've been very struck in one of my columns since I don't follow this regularly, but one statistic, which is that in low-income countries, the number of people who are below the absolute poverty level or the extreme poverty level, I don't know what you would now call it, has ceased to fall. After a long period when we had a stupendous success in reducing the number of extremely poor people relative to the world's population, this has sort of stopped. That's very, very depressing. And if we are making debt whole by sacrificing countries in this way, then I would consider this a miserable failure. So to me, the interesting or important question is not whether these countries can service their debts, because in some sense, if you're sufficiently determined and the creditors are sufficiently ruthless, they can, but what is the cost in terms of development prospects and human welfare of their being required to do, or feeling that they are obliged, and perhaps rightly obliged, to do so, rightly obliged in the sense that the cost of default will be so terrible. But I am concerned that there's a lot of hidden suffering here, which is not just short-term but long-term, and that would make the solvency come at a very, very, very high price. And that comes to sort of the big issues. I think you're absolutely right. Some very good things happened. The agreement on the SDRs, attempts to manage debt, common framework, and so forth. The new quota increases. There's a lot of discussion now, the possibility of capital increases for the multilateral development banks. But I would say that far too little of the SDRs did end up with poor countries, that the impact of higher interest rates upon them is very disturbing, and after all, they didn't cause any of the problems that they are now suffering from, particularly the inflation problem. They are the victims of the terms of trade shocks which followed from some of these crises. I think that, I won't go into more detail, I am very concerned that there is sort of hidden suffering, not very hidden suffering, among hundreds and hundreds of millions of people, in fact far more than that. And making the financial sector system whole is, to my mind, less important than resolving that problem. I've tended to have rather radical views on debt for quite a long time. And I do feel that if a lot of really poor countries are feeling obliged to go to the private markets, given the well-known problems with those markets, the illiquidity problem that you mentioned, and the consequence of that, we really haven't been doing enough to provide the resources that are needed to make development successful across the entire world.